When German forces approached what they believed was an abandoned Allied position in the frozen Belgian countryside, they expected no resistance. They were catastrophically wrong. This is the story of extraordinary courage against impossible odds. A single gunner who refused to surrender when every logical reason demanded retreat. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. The largest battle on the Western Front was about to witness an act of defiance that would echo through military history. The date was December 16, 1944. Adolf Hitler had unleashed Operation Walk am Rhein, what history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, crashed through the snow-covered Ardennes, targeting the thinly held American lines. The objective was audacious: split the Allied forces, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. In the path of this avalanche stood units of the U.S. 106th Infantry Division, men who had arrived in Europe just days earlier, green troops facing Hitler's last great gamble. Among these positions was a small observation post and supply depot near Schönberg, manned by a skeleton crew from the 589th Field Artillery Battalion. Most personnel had been withdrawn during the night as intelligence reports suggested a possible enemy probe. What remained was essential equipment, ammunition stores, and a communication station, assets that couldn't be quickly evacuated. Corporal Warner W. Holzinger, a 23-year-old gunner from Wisconsin, had volunteered to remain behind with a single M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun to provide covering fire if needed during the final evacuation phase. His orders were simple: maintain watch until 0800 hours, then withdraw with the rear guard. But at 0530 hours, as dawn barely touched the frozen horizon, the thunder of German artillery shattered the morning silence. The offensive had begun hours earlier than Allied intelligence predicted. The first shells screamed overhead at 0537 hours, massive 150mm rounds that shook the earth and sent frozen dirt cascading from the log-reinforced positions. Holzinger pressed himself against the frozen ground as the barrage intensified, the distinctive crack of German 88mm guns mixing with the deeper roar of heavy howitzers. This wasn't a probe. This was the main assault. Through the smoke and snow, Holzinger could see the tree line approximately 400 yards to the east erupting with muzzle flashes. German infantry were already advancing under the cover of their artillery. He grabbed the field telephone, cranking the handle desperately. Dead. The first salvo had severed the communication lines. He was alone, cut off, with no way to call for support or receive orders. By 0600 hours, the artillery barrage shifted deeper into American territory, moving past his position, the classic German tactic of rolling barrage before the infantry assault. Holzinger knew what came next. He checked his Browning machine gun one more time. The weapon was a masterpiece of American engineering, capable of firing 450 to 600 rounds per minute, with an effective range of 1,800 yards. He had approximately 1,500 rounds of linked .50 caliber ammunition in belts and cans around his position. Against what was coming, it seemed pathetically inadequate. The fog of war, both literal and figurative, obscured the valley below. Morning mist mixed with gun smoke created an eerie gray curtain. Then, at 0615 hours, he saw them. Shadows moving through the tree line. First a few, then dozens, then what appeared to be an entire company of German infantry emerging from the forest. They moved with the confidence of veterans, maintaining tactical spacing, using available cover. These weren't conscripts. They were likely from the 18th Volksgrenadier Division, experienced troops who had survived the Eastern Front. Holzinger faced an impossible decision. His orders had been to withdraw. Every tactical manual, every training scenario screamed at him to abandon the position and fall back to friendly lines while he still could. The Germans clearly believed the position was abandoned. They were advancing with minimal caution, obviously informed by their intelligence that American forces had withdrawn during the night. But behind him lay tons of artillery ammunition, fuel stores, medical supplies, and communications equipment that hadn't been fully evacuated. If the Germans captured this depot intact, they would gain supplies desperately needed for their offensive. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell would extend their advance, cost Allied lives. By 06:25 hours, the German formation had closed to 300 yards. Holzinger could see individual soldiers now, field gray uniforms stark against the snow, breath steaming in the frozen air, rifles at the ready. Officers were gesturing, directing their men toward the American positions. They were walking into what they believed was an empty camp, ready to claim an easy prize. The young corporal's hands tightened on the Browning's butterfly trigger. His heart hammered against his ribs. Fear and duty wrestled in his chest. Little did the approaching Germans know that their assumption of an abandoned position was about to become a fatal mistake. At 0628 hours, the lead German elements reached 200 yards. Holzinger could wait no longer. He had to act now or lose any tactical advantage. The Browning was perfectly zeroed, ammunition belt seated, bolt charged. Through the iron sights, he selected his first target, a German officer gesturing to his troops, clearly directing them toward the depot buildings. At 0629 hours, Holzinger squeezed the trigger. The Browning roared to life with a sound like ripping canvas, the heavy .50 caliber rounds tearing through the frozen air at 2,900 feet per second. The German officer went down instantly, followed by 3 soldiers behind him. The entire enemy formation seemed to freeze for a split second, the universal moment of shocked disbelief when ambush shatters expectation. Then chaos erupted. German troops dove for cover behind snow banks, fallen logs, anything that might shield them from the devastating fire. But the Browning's heavy rounds punched through light cover with contemptuous ease. A burst caught 2 soldiers attempting to shelter behind a wooden cart. The .50 caliber rounds splintered the wood and killed both men. Another burst shredded a small pine tree and the soldier crouching behind it. The Germans recovered quickly, their training and experience taking over. Return fire erupted from dozens of positions. The distinctive crack of Kar 98K rifles, the faster chatter of MP-40 submachine guns, and the deep thump of stick grenades. Rounds snapped past Holzinger's position, thudding into the log reinforcement and kicking up frozen earth. A burst from a German MG-42 machine gun, firing at nearly 1,200 rounds per minute, raked across his sandbag parapet, one round passing so close to his helmet he felt the shock wave. For 20 brutal minutes, Holzinger maintained fire discipline, engaging targets with short, controlled bursts. The Browning's barrel began to glow cherry red despite the freezing temperature. Brass casings piled up around his position, steaming in the cold air. His hands moved with mechanical precision, firing, releasing the trigger, selecting new targets, firing again. The weapon's recoil hammered his shoulder, but adrenaline made him numb to the pain. The Germans, professional soldiers that they were, quickly organized a flanking maneuver. While the main body maintained suppressing fire, a squad of approximately 10 men began working their way through a shallow ravine to Holzinger's left, using the terrain to shield their movement. He caught glimpses of them through gaps in the cover, gray uniforms against white snow, moving fast and low. At 0651 hours, his worst fear materialized. A German potato masher grenade arced through the air, landing 15 feet from his position. Holzinger threw himself flat as the explosion showered his position with frozen dirt and shrapnel. His ears rang violently. Before he could recover, 2 more grenades followed, one exploding close enough that fragments tore through his left sleeve, leaving bleeding cuts along his forearm. Through the smoke and confusion, German infantry rushed his position. They came screaming, the primal sound men make when charging into death. Holzinger swung the Browning left, firing from the hip, the weapon bucking wildly. The first 2 Germans went down in a tangle of limbs. The third took rounds through the chest, but his momentum carried him within 5 feet before he collapsed. But there were too many. A German NCO emerged from the smoke to Holzinger's right, MP-40 raised. Time seemed to slow. The corporal knew he couldn't swing the heavy machine gun around fast enough. In desperation, he released the Browning and grabbed his M1911 pistol from its holster, a weapon that had seemed almost ceremonial when issued but now represented his only chance at survival. He fired twice. The first shot missed. The second struck the German in the shoulder, spinning him around. The German submachine gun clattered to the frozen ground. Before Holzinger could fire again, another German soldier appeared, rifle raised, and aimed directly at the American's chest from less than 10 feet away. This was the moment. This was where the impossible stand would end. Holzinger stared down the barrel of the Kar 98K rifle, saw the German soldier's finger tightening on the trigger. His mind registered the man's young face, probably 19, maybe 20 years old. Just another soldier doing his duty, like himself. The sharp crack of rifle fire split the air, but Holzinger felt no impact. The German soldier before him jerked violently and collapsed. Behind him, more German troops were falling, not from Holzinger's fire, but from an entirely different direction. Through the smoke and chaos, he heard the most beautiful sound in the world. American voices shouting commands, the deeper bark of M1 Garand rifles, and the rapid fire of American light machine guns. Elements of the 589th Field Artillery Battalion's rear guard, delayed by mechanical issues with their trucks, had been approaching the depot from the west when they heard the firefight. Lieutenant James Hendricks, commanding a makeshift force of 23 artillerymen and headquarters personnel, had immediately ordered his men into a hasty assault formation and moved to support what he assumed was an ambushed patrol. What he found instead was a lone gunner who had held off an entire German company for over 30 minutes. Hendricks' small force hit the Germans from an unexpected angle, their surprise assault breaking the enemy's momentum. Caught between Holzinger's still-firing Browning and the unexpected American reinforcements, the German formation wavered. At 0704 hours, a German junior officer, likely the company's second-in-command after Holzinger killed the first, made a critical decision. He ordered withdrawal. The Germans pulled back in good order, maintaining fire discipline, carrying their wounded but leaving their dead behind. They had expected an easy capture of an abandoned position. Instead, they had run into unexpectedly fierce resistance and taken severe casualties. Holzinger continued firing short bursts to cover the German withdrawal, his training overriding his exhaustion. Don't give them time to reorganize. Don't let them realize how close they came to overrunning the position. Keep the pressure on. The Browning's barrel was dangerously overheated now, the metal glowing bright red. Cordite smoke hung thick in the frozen air, mixing with the copper smell of blood. When Lieutenant Hendricks reached Holzinger's position at 0709 hours, he found the young corporal still behind his gun, methodically scanning for targets, his hands steady on the weapon despite the trembling that racked the rest of his body. Around his position lay over 40 empty ammunition cans, more than 1,200 spent brass casings glinting in the weak morning light, and the evidence of a desperate close-quarters fight. Discarded German equipment, impact craters from grenades, blood-stained snow. "Corporal," Hendricks said quietly, placing a hand on Holzinger's shoulder. "You can stand down now. We've got the position." Only then did Holzinger release the Browning's grips. His hands were bleeding from gripping the hot metal through his worn gloves. His left arm bled freely from shrapnel wounds. His ears rang so violently he could barely hear the lieutenant's words. But the position was held. The depot was secure. The Germans had been denied the supplies they needed. Within minutes, Hendricks organized a proper defensive perimeter while medics treated Holzinger's wounds and several other men who had been hit during the relief action. The young corporal insisted he didn't need evacuation. He could still fight. That stubbornness, that refusal to quit, had saved not just equipment and supplies, but likely dozens of American lives. Had the Germans captured this depot, their advance would have gained crucial momentum during those critical first hours of the Battle of the Bulge. As combat engineers arrived to begin demolishing what couldn't be evacuated, Hendricks counted the German casualties visible from the American position. 18 bodies lay scattered across the snow. At least twice that number had been wounded and carried away. A single machine gunner, against an entire company, had inflicted devastating casualties and achieved a tactical victory that seemed impossible by any rational assessment. What happened next would become legendary in the 589th Field Artillery Battalion. Word of Holzinger's stand spread through the unit, then through the division, carried by witnesses and survivors of those desperate December days. In a battle where entire regiments surrendered, where chaos reigned and communications collapsed, one soldier's refusal to abandon his post became a symbol of American determination. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for 6 more weeks, ultimately costing over 89,000 American casualties and 100,000 German casualties. The German offensive, despite initial successes, ultimately failed to achieve any of its strategic objectives. By the end of January 1945, Allied forces had pushed the Germans back to their starting positions, and the Wehrmacht never again possessed the strength to mount a major offensive operation. Corporal Warner Holzinger survived the war. For his actions on December 16, 1944, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest decoration for valor, awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. The citation noted his exceptional courage and selfless devotion to duty in the face of overwhelming enemy forces, crediting his actions with preventing the enemy from capturing critical supplies and inflicting significant casualties on attacking German forces. Lieutenant Hendricks received the Silver Star for his quick thinking and decisive action in reinforcing Holzinger's position. 3 other men from the relief force received Bronze Stars with Vitavice for valor. The 589th Field Artillery Battalion's war diary recorded the engagement in unusual detail, noting that a single soldier's stand had validated every principle they had tried to instill in their troops: courage, initiative, and dedication to mission above personal safety. In post-war interviews, Holzinger was characteristically modest about his actions. "I was just doing what I was trained to do," he told a military historian in 1947. "When you're behind that gun and you see the enemy coming, you don't think about medals or glory. You think about doing your job and getting through the next 5 minutes alive." Every soldier who stood his ground during the Bulge was a hero. I just happened to be alone when it was my turn. But his fellow veterans knew better. In a war filled with acts of extraordinary courage, Holzinger's solitary stand represented something profound: the power of individual determination against impossible odds. Modern military analysts who have studied the engagement note that his tactical decisions were textbook correct. Wait until optimal range, target leadership first, maintain fire discipline, use the psychological impact of the heavy machine gun to maximum effect. But no textbook can teach the courage required to execute those tactics when facing an entire company alone. The exact German unit Holzinger engaged remains uncertain. Records from that chaotic period are incomplete, and German documentation was often lost in the final months of the war. What is certain is that an entire enemy formation, experienced troops expecting an easy victory, instead encountered resistance so fierce they withdrew after suffering catastrophic casualties. The small depot near Schomberg was finally evacuated at 0730 hours on December 16. What couldn't be carried was destroyed by engineers to prevent its capture. By noon that day, German forces controlled the area, but they gained nothing. Only cold earth, destroyed equipment, and the bodies of their own dead to remind them that American forces would not yield easily. 1 gunner, 1 machine gun. Impossible odds. Yet when German forces discovered that what they thought was an abandoned position was defended by a soldier who refused to quit, they learned a hard lesson about American resolve. Corporal Warner Holzinger's stand on that frozen December morning represented the finest traditions of military service: courage, initiative, and devotion to duty against overwhelming odds. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.